My name is Pearl, and I was 61 years old the morning a man half my age, in a suit that cost more than I make in a month, slid a letter under my door and doubled the rent on the only home I'd had for 30 years. I was just off a double shift. I'm a home health aide. I spend my days lifting people who can't lift themselves, bathing them, sitting with them at 3 a.m. when they're scared. My feet were swollen. My name tag was still on. And I stood in my own little kitchen in that old Chicago 6 flat and read a letter from a company called Kestrel Capital telling me that my rent was going from $900 a month to $1,800, effective in 60 days. $1,800. On my income. We both knew I couldn't pay it. That was the point. The man who'd bought my building was named Trent Mackey, and a week after the letter he knocked on my door in person to make sure I understood it. He couldn't have been more than 35. Nice teeth, nice watch, the easy confidence of a man who has never once in his life been told no by someone who could make it stick. He stepped into my doorway without quite being invited, and he looked around my apartment, 30 years of my life. My late mother's quilt folded over the back of the couch, my African violets on the windowsill, the little dent in the doorframe where I'd marked the heights of the Reyes kids one summer. And he smiled at all of it like it was already a renovation photo, like he was mentally pricing the fixtures. "I'm sure you'll find somewhere that fits your budget a little better," he said. "There are nice senior places out by the county line. Honestly, this neighborhood's changing, Miss Dawson. It's probably for the best." And then he gave me the line. The one I'd come to hate more than any other. The one men like him keep in their back pocket for exactly these moments. Nothing personal. It's just business. It's just business. As if a home were ever just business to the person who lives in it. As if 30 years could be a line item. He said it the way you'd tell a stranger you were taking the parking spot they'd been waiting for. And then he was gone. Down the dark stairs, already on his phone, already on to the next thing, certain he'd never have to think about me again. He was going to think about me a great deal. And here's the thing he didn't know. He looked at me, a tired, heavy, 61-year-old caregiver, with her name tag still on. And he saw a woman he could push out with one piece of paper. What he never bothered to check was the other piece of paper. The one I'd kept in a safe deposit box for 16 years. The one a dying man signed in shaky handwriting, with a lawyer in the room the week before he passed. The one that meant Trent Mackey did not own what he thought he owned. Welcome to composed drama stories, where the women everyone underestimated finally tell their side. If quiet strength and slow justice are your kind of evening, stay with me. Before I'm done, you're going to watch a 35-year-old developer with a building full of lawyers climb up my dark staircase, sit down on my mother's quilt, and beg me to let him out of the trap he built for himself. You're going to find out what a lonely old man hid in a safe deposit box to protect a woman who never once asked him for anything. But to understand how the woman with the name tag ended up holding all the cards, I have to start at the beginning with the letter, and then with soul. Let me tell you about that letter first, because I want you to feel the size of it. 900 to 1,800. People who've never been poor don't understand what a number like that does to you. It isn't an inconvenience. It's an eviction with a smile on it. He knew exactly what I made these companies pull your whole financial life before they ever buy a building. They know your income down to the dollar before they know your name. He knew I was a single woman on a homemaid's wages. No savings to speak of, no husband, no children to take me in. Doubling my rent wasn't about money. If he'd actually wanted more money from me, He'd have raised it $80, and I'd have found the $80 somehow, skipped something, taken an extra shift. Doubling it was never a rent increase. It was a message written in the only language people like Trent Mackey respect. And the message was, leave. You don't belong in the future I'm building here. Disappear quietly, and don't make a fuss while you do it. I stood there reading it twice, 3 times, the way you reread a diagnosis, waiting for the words to rearrange themselves into something survivable. They didn't. I'd lived in that apartment for 30 years. I'd hung my mother's quilt over that couch the week she died. I knew which stair creaked and which window stuck and which radiator ticked at night like a heartbeat. And a man I'd never met had decided, from behind a desk, that all of it was over, for the price of a piece of paper and a stamp. And it wasn't just me. Within that same week, every long-term tenant in the building got the same letter. The Reyes family on the first floor, with their 3 kids and their 12 years in that apartment, doubled. Old Mr. Kaminsky, on 2, who'd lived there since before I ever moved in, 83 years old, and on a fixed Social Security income that doesn't double when your rent does doubled. Trent Mackey had bought our building, looked at the 6 families who'd quietly made it a home for decades, and decided on a spreadsheet that we were an inefficiency. We were in the way of his money. He wanted us gone so he could gut the place, slap in some quartz countertops and a fresh coat of gray paint, and rent our homes for 3 times what we paid to people who'd never know our names. But to understand why a dying man handed me a weapon I wouldn't need to use for 16 years, you have to go back to the beginning. You have to let me tell you about Soul. I moved into that 6 flat when I was 31 years old, fresh off a divorce, with 2 suitcases, and almost nothing else. The building was owned by a man named Soul Adler, who'd built it with his own brother back in the 1950s and had lived in the garden apartment ever since. Soul was old even then, a widower, no children, a quiet man with thick glasses who fixed the radiators himself and left the back door unlocked for the cat that wasn't even his. He charged fair rent. He knew everyone's name. When my checks were short those first hard years, Soul would wave his hand and say, "Pay me when the world's kinder. Pearl the radiator still works either way." That was Soul. The world doesn't make many like him, and it's busy forgetting the ones it had. Over the years, Soul and I became close. I'd bring him soup. He'd tell me stories about the old neighborhood, about his brother, about a wife he'd loved for 40 years and lost. And then Soul got old in the way that needs help the way I happen to know something about. Because helping is my whole life's work. His eyes failed. His hands shook. He couldn't manage the stairs, the cooking, the pills, the long nights. And he had no one. No children, no family left, nobody in the world, just a building full of tenants and a woman in 3B who happened to do this for a living and happened to love him. So I took care of Soul Adler. For the last 5 years of his life, I was his caregiver, not for money. Never for money. I did it before my shifts and after them. I bathed him and cooked for him and drove him to his doctors and sat with him through the long nights when he was frightened, the same way I do for strangers. Except Soul wasn't a stranger. Soul was family. The realest family I had. I want you to know what that actually looked like, because it's the soil everything else grew out of. I'd come home from a 12-hour shift caring for other people's parents, and I'd go straight down to the garden apartment to care for Soul. I'd find him sitting in the dark because he couldn't see well enough to find the lamp switch anymore, and too proud to call anyone. I learned his medications. I cut his food small. When his hands shook too badly to shave, I shaved him. And he'd tell me about his wife, Miriam, the same 3 stories every time. And every time I'd act like I'd never heard them, because the joy on his face was worth more than the truth. On his good days, he'd shuffle out to the stoop and watch the neighborhood and tell me which families were struggling and slip me a few dollars to leave on their door from nobody. That was soul. Quiet good, done in the dark, with no name on it. There was a night near the end when he spiked a fever, and I sat on the floor by his bed all night with a cold cloth, missing my own sleep before a double. And somewhere around 4 a.m, he gripped my hand and said, "Pearl, you're the only one who ever came back. Everybody comes once. You came back." I've thought about that sentence 1,000 times since. You came back. That's the whole job. In my work and in this life. Most people come once. The world turns on the few who come back. I held his hand in the hospital at the very end, and I was the one who made the arrangements, and I was the one who buried him, because there was no one else to do it. Maybe a dozen people came. I gave the eulogy to a half-empty room. The world had forgotten Soul Adler, but I hadn't. And as it turned out, Soul hadn't forgotten me either. And here is the part that matters. About a week before he died, Soul asked me to help him into a car, and he had me drive him to his lawyer's office downtown. He was so weak by then, I had to help him up every step. He wouldn't tell me why we were going. He made me wait in the hall while he met with the lawyer. For the better part of an hour, I could hear the low murmur of their voices through the door, Soul's shaky and insistent. And when he finally came out, leaning on my arm, he handed me a thick envelope, and his eyes behind those thick glasses were wet. And he said, "Don't open this till I'm gone. And Pearl, don't ever lose it. Promise me, there are wolves that come for buildings like mine. After men like me are gone. They wait. This is so they can never come for you. So you'll always have a home, no matter who I'm not here to stop." I thought he was being a sentimental old man saying goodbye. I told him to stop talking like that he had years left. He didn't have years. He had 8 days, and I never did get him to explain what he'd done that afternoon. Because we don't talk about wills and leases when we're busy pretending someone isn't dying. I didn't understand. So I did the one thing he asked. I put that envelope in a safe deposit box at my bank. Because Soul told me not to lose it. And Soul had asked me for almost nothing in his whole life, and then I grieved him. And life went on. And the building got sold after his estate settled, and then sold again, and the rent crept up the normal amount over the years, and the new owners were faceless companies who'd never heard his name. And I honestly, to my shame, almost forgot what was in that box. I shouldn't have forgotten. But you don't think about wolves until you hear them at the door. Now let me tell you about the campaign. Because Trent Mackey did not simply raise the rent and wait politely. When we didn't all vanish on command, he went to work on us, and I need you to feel how ugly it got. First, the repairs stopped. Completely, Miss Kaminsky's radiator went cold in November in Chicago. In November, and Kestrel Capital didn't answer the phone. The Reyes family had a leak under their sink for 3 weeks. Water creeping across the floor where their toddler played, and nothing. The hallway light blew out and stayed out. So we were all coming home in the dark up a black staircase. An 83-year-old man feeling his way along the wall. It wasn't neglect. I want to be clear about that. It was strategy. Make them miserable enough and they'll leave on their own. And you won't even have to evict them. I've learned since that it has a name in those circles. They call it encouraging turnover. Turnover like we were a stain they were trying to lift. I'd go check on Mr. Kaminsky and find him sitting in his coat and gloves in his own living room, his breath fogging, telling me he was fine, don't make a fuss. An old man in his coat in his own home, in an American winter, because a young man with a spreadsheet had decided his discomfort was a line item. I have spent my life keeping vulnerable people warm and safe and cared for. To watch someone deliberately make them cold and scared, on purpose. For money, something hardened in me that I didn't have a name for yet. Then came the pressure. One family at a time. Trent's people were smart. They didn't fight us as a group. They peeled us off one by one. They'd offer a relocation payment, a few $1,000s, to anybody who'd sign away their home and leave by the end of the month. To a scared family with a cold apartment and a landlord who won't fix the heat, a few $1,000s and an exit can feel like mercy. And one by one, my neighbors started to take it. The young couple on the third floor took the money and left. A family on the second floor took it. I don't blame a single one of them when you're frightened and alone, and the man with the lawyers tells you you've already lost. You take the lifeboat. But every moving truck out front was a little funeral. The building I'd loved for 30 years was emptying out around me, going quiet floor by floor, lights going dark in windows that had glowed for decades. And that quiet was the loneliest sound I ever heard. I'd lived among these families through births and deaths and graduations. I watched them carry their lives down those dark stairs in cardboard boxes, and I felt like the last person standing in a house that was being dismantled around me while I was still inside it. And the pressure on me got personal, because Trent figured out fast that I was the holdout. And I was. I need you to understand why. Because it isn't just stubbornness. That building was not an apartment to me. It was the only place on this earth that had ever simply let me stay. I'd come there at 31 with 2 suitcases and a failed marriage, and nothing else. And it had taken me in. I'd buried my mother while living there and hung her quilt on that wall. I'd loved and lost soul there. Every person who'd ever truly been my family, I had been family to inside those brick walls. I had no children to go to, no husband, no money, no backup plan. That apartment was my whole history, and my entire future stacked in 3 small rooms. And a stranger wanted me to hand it over for a relocation check and a thank you. Some things you do not have it in you to walk away from. And the only home that ever kept you is one of them. So I dug in. And digging in made me the enemy. I was the one telling the Reyeses to think twice before they signed. I was the one helping Mr. Kaminsky call the city about his heat, sitting with him while he shivered, refusing to let him be frozen out quietly. I was the one who wouldn't take the check and wouldn't go silent. So in Trent Mackey's ledger, I stopped being a tenant and became a problem. And Trent Mackey dealt with problems. There were phone calls, always from a pleasant-voiced man who never gave a last name. "Miss Dawson, you're only making this harder on yourself. You really want to fight a company like ours? At your age?" My lock got changed once while I was at work, an administrative error, they called it later, when I stood in the hallway in the dark, unable to get into my own home, my groceries melting at my feet, the building silent and hostile around me. I had to call a locksmith and pay him myself to get back into the apartment I'd lived in for 30 years. That night, I understood the message in my bones. We can reach into your life whenever we want. You are not safe here. Leave, then Trent himself stopped by again, and this time he dropped the smile. He stood in my doorway, and he looked at me like a man looks at a slow car in his lane. And he said, "Let me be straight with you, since the nice version isn't landing. I've got lawyers who do this in their sleep. I've got money you can't imagine. You've got a name tag and a quilt. How do you think this ends, Pearl? Be smart. Take the check. You've got a name tag. How do you think this ends?" I want to tell you I was brave in that moment. I wasn't. I was 61 and frightened and bone-tired, and I went inside and sat on my mother's quilt in the dark, and I cried. Because I believed him. I believed that a man with money and lawyers could take my home. Because I had spent my whole life watching exactly that happen to people like me, quietly, legally, with a smile and a relocation check. That is the cruelest thing about being underestimated for long enough. Eventually you start to do it to yourself. You start to agree with them. I sat there, in the dark, doing the math of where a 61-year-old caregiver goes when her home is taken the shelters, the couches, the long bus rides to whatever's left and cheap and far, and the math was ugly, and I was scared all the way down to the floor of myself. And then, somewhere in the middle of that long black night, I heard Soul's voice, clear as if he were sitting in the chair across from me. There are wolves that come for buildings like mine. This is so they can never come for you. And I sat up. Because he knew. 16 years ago, a dying half-blind old man had looked all the way down the road and seen Trent Mackey coming, not Trent by name, but Trent by type. The wolf that always eventually comes, and he had done something about it, with the last strength in his shaking hands. He had reached into the future to protect me, and I had been so busy drowning in my own fear that I'd left his gift locked in a box and nearly forgotten it existed. That was the night I stopped crying. Not because I suddenly felt strong, I didn't. I felt sick and small. But because I realized I'd been so busy being afraid that I had forgotten to actually fight. And fighting, when I finally thought about it clearly, is not some special talent that belongs to people with money and lawyers. Fighting is just helping yourself the way you'd help somebody you loved. I'd spent 30 years refusing to let frightened, vulnerable people face the worst alone. It was past time I extended myself the same courtesy. So the next morning, before my shift, on no sleep, I drove to the bank, and I had them bring me to the little room with the boxes, and I opened that safe deposit box for the first time in 16 years. Let me tell you what was in Soul Adler's envelope. My hands were shaking when I opened it in that little vault room, and not from the cold. Inside was a lease. But not a normal lease. Soul, with his shaky hands and a real lawyer in the room to make it airtight, had signed me a lease on my apartment that ran for 50 years. 50, with more than 30 years still left to run on it. At a fixed rent that could only rise by a tiny capped amount each year, which is why, 16 years later, I was still paying almost exactly $900, while the neighborhood around me had tripled. That wasn't an accident, or good luck. Soul had built it that way on purpose. So that no matter what the world did, I would always be able to afford to stay. And there was more language in there. Careful, dense lawyer language that I couldn't make sense of yet, but would come to love like scripture. I sat in that little room and held it, and I could feel him in it, the care of it, the foresight, the love. A man who could barely see the page had spent some of the last good days of his life making sure a tired woman in 3B would never be put out in the cold. I didn't understand half of what I was holding, but I understood that much. So I did the thing you're supposed to do and that almost nobody tells poor people they're allowed to do. I got help. I took that lease to a free legal aid tenants clinic, and I sat down across a scratched table from a young lawyer named Dana Cho, and I watched her read it, and I watched her face change. She read it twice. Then she looked up at me and she said, very quietly, Miss Dawson, "Do you understand what you're holding?" I said no. She told me, and I want to explain it to you the way she explained it to me, in plain words, because this is the heart of everything. The first thing she said was this: a lease runs with the land. That's the phrase. It means a lease doesn't belong to the landlord who signed it, it belongs to the property itself. When Soul sold, when the building changed hands again and again, every new owner bought it with my lease attached, whether they read the fine print or not. Trent Mackey's company bought my building, and they bought it with 30 more years of my $900 rent legally chained to it. He could no more double my rent than he could change the weather. He'd sent me a letter raising my rent to $1,800, and that letter wasn't worth the paper it was printed on. He just didn't know it yet. Think of it this way, Dana said. He didn't buy a building with a tenant he could remove. He bought a building with you, welded to it, for 30 years, at $900. There is nothing he can legally do about it. Nothing. I made her say it twice, because 30 years of being treated like I was disposable doesn't unwind in one sentence. But she meant it. The doubled rent was a bluff. The eviction threats were a bluff. The whole towering thing Trent Mackey had used to terrify me and empty my building was built on the assumption that I had no rights. And Soul had quietly made sure, 16 years ago, that I had more rights than the man who thought he owned the place. But that wasn't even the part that made Dana put down her coffee. Because Soul, careful, quiet, wolf-fearing Soul had put one more thing in my lease: a right of first refusal. Dana explained it slowly, making sure I understood, because she could tell it was going to matter. It means that if the owner ever wants to sell the whole building, not just my unit, I have the legal right to be offered it first, before anyone else. At whatever price they've agreed to sell for, I get the first chance to match it and buy it myself. Soul had written it so that the people who lived in his building could never simply be sold out from under, traded between investors like a crate of goods, without the residents getting a real legal shot at owning it themselves. Soul Adler, 16 years in his grave, had handed me not just a shield, but a key. Miss Dawson, Dana said, and she leaned forward. This is one of the most protective leases I have ever seen in my entire career. Somebody who really knew what they were doing, who really cared about you, sat down with a good lawyer and built you a fortress. And I would bet everything I own that your landlord has no idea it exists. He bought a cheap, tired building to flip fast. People who do that move quick and cut corners they don't crawl through 50 years of recorded documents on a 6-flat they bought for pennies. He thinks he bought an empty box he can do anything with. What he actually bought was you. And he has absolutely no idea. I sat in that little clinic office and I started, finally, to laugh. Not a happy laugh, exactly 16 years of grief and 3 months of fear coming out sideways. Because all those nights I'd believed Trent Mackey when he told me how it ends, and the whole time, the answer to how does this end had been sitting in a metal box in my bank, in the shaky handwriting of a man I'd shaved and fed and buried, a man the world had thrown away, and I had loved anyway. Here is where I stopped being prey and started being a problem Trent Mackey could not buy, scare, or evict his way out of. And I want to be honest about how I did it. Because nobody rescued me. Dana didn't ride in and save me. Dana handed me a map and taught me to read it, the way I teach a frightened patient to manage their own medicine. What I did with that map, I did myself, on my swollen feet, between double shifts. The first thing I did was stop being alone. I'd watched Trent peel us off one by one because we were scared and isolated, each family fighting in the dark, never comparing notes. So I went door to door to every family still left, the Reyeses, Miss, Kaminsky, the two other holdout units, and I sat in their kitchens, the way I sit with frightened patients. And I told them what I'd learned. I told them about leases that run with the land. I told them most of them had real rights, too, that you cannot legally freeze an old man out of his apartment by shutting off his heat in a Chicago winter. That's not hardball. That's against the law. And the city has teeth for it. I told them to stop answering Trent's calls alone and start answering them together. I made coffee, and I put 6 terrified households in one room. And I watched something change in that room, the thing that changes when scared people stop being scared by themselves. We weren't 6 families anymore. We were a building. And I'll be honest, that was the part I was actually good at, not the law. The people. 30 years of caregiving teaches you how to make a frightened person feel safe enough to stand up. I'd never organized anything in my life. But it turns out, organizing is just caregiving, pointed at a whole building instead of one bed. We started keeping track of everything together every cold night, every ignored repair call, every threatening phone call with no last name, not me hoarding paper in a drawer. But all of us, out loud, in a shared notebook on the Reyes' kitchen table, building a true account of exactly what this man was doing to people in their own homes. The second thing I did was let Trent keep digging his own grave, because I realized I didn't have to throw a single punch. He was knocking himself out. Every illegal thing he'd done to force us out, the dead radiators, the lockout, the harassment, the threats, every one of those was now a violation, with my neighbors as witnesses and the city of Chicago as the referee. Dana helped us file the complaints, but we made them, all of us. Together, the city inspectors came, and suddenly the cold radiator and the leak under the sink and the dark stairwell weren't sad little inconveniences we suffered in private, they were citations. Fines. An official record with Kestrel Capital's name stamped on every line. The man who thought he could break the rules because we were too small to stop him discovered we were not too small. We were just quiet. And quiet is not the same as weak. He'd spent his whole career confusing the two, and it was about to cost him everything. I remember the day the first inspector actually came, a tired man with a clipboard who'd seen it all, and he walked up to Mr. Kaminsky's cold apartment and put his hand on that dead radiator in January, and his jaw tightened. He didn't say much. He just started writing. And Mr. Kaminsky, 83 years old, who'd been apologizing for making a fuss for 2 solid months, stood a little straighter, watching that pen move. That was the moment, I think, that the building stopped being afraid. Because we saw, finally, in black and white, that the rules were not only for people like Trent. There were rules for him too. And we had just learned how to use them. The fear in that staircase started turning into something else. Something with a spine. But I was saving the real blow for last, and it came from understanding what Trent actually wanted, which is the thing nobody scared ever stops to do. They react. I watched. He didn't want to be a landlord. He didn't want my building. He wanted to flip it to empty it, gut it, renovate it, and sell it fast to the next investor for a fat profit, and then go do it to some other neighborhood. That was the entire plan. And his entire plan had a fatal flaw he didn't know about. And the flaw's name was Saul Adler. Because you cannot sell a clean, empty, flippable building when there's a 30-year, $900 lease welded to it. No investor on earth wants a property they can't empty and can't raise rents on for 3 decades. My lease wasn't just a shield for me, it was a wrecking ball, aimed straight at the resale value of everything Trent had bought. The moment any serious buyer's lawyer pulled the recorded documents on that building, really pulled them, the way Trent's own people had been too cheap and too arrogant to do, before they bought they would find me. And they would run for the hills. So I made sure they found me. When I learned, through the neighborhood grapevine, that Trent had quietly put the building on the market to dump it and move on to his next target, I didn't go to court. I didn't make a scene. I didn't need to. I had Dana send one calm, professional letter to Trent, to his broker, and into the record where any buyer's attorney would be sure to see it. The letter did 2 things, very politely. It informed all parties that Unit 3B was held under a recorded 50-year lease with more than 30 years remaining, binding on any successor owner at a fixed rent of $900. And it formally asserted my right of first refusal, that before this building could be lawfully sold to anyone on earth, it had to be offered, in writing, to me. 1 letter. No yelling. No drama. Just the quiet, devastating sound of a trap that had been set 16 years ago finally closing. I wish I could have seen Trent Mackey's face when that letter landed on his desk. I imagine it was the same face I'd been making for 3 months. Now let me tell you how it actually ended. Because the reckoning didn't come in a courtroom, and it didn't come with me dramatically fanning out papers on a table in front of a crowd. It came quietly. The way the truest justice does it came when Trent Mackey, the man who'd told me I had a name tag and he had lawyers, finally had to climb up my dark staircase and knock on my door. Because for the first time in this entire story, he was the one who needed something from me. The flip was dead, and he knew it the second that letter hit. No buyer would touch a building with my lease bolted onto it. The offers dried up overnight. He couldn't empty me out. He couldn't raise my rent. He couldn't sell at the profit he'd dreamed about. And meanwhile, the city fines for all his encouraging turnover were stacking up against Kestrel Capital like snow on a windshield. He had paid real money for a building that was now, thanks to a dead man's kindness and a tired caregiver who finally read her own mail. A stone around his neck. He was, in every way that mattered, in the exact spot he'd tried so hard to put me in, trapped, bleeding money, and out of moves. So he came to me. He stood in my doorway, no $4,000 smile this time, no swagger, the suit a little rumpled, and he asked if we could talk like reasonable people. I let him in. I made him sit on my mother's quilt, in the apartment he'd schemed for months to take from me, and I made him a cup of coffee, because I am who I am, and then I sat down across from him, and I let him say his piece. He'd lost it all, the smirk, the certainty, the how do you think this ends? He wanted to know what it would take to make me go away. He talked fast, the way frightened people do, about how we could find a number that works for everybody. He offered me money again, far more this time, a sum that 3 months earlier would have made my head spin, because now I was costing him a fortune just by continuing to exist in my own home. And this is the moment I had waited my whole tired, overlooked life for. So I want to tell you exactly what I did with it, because it's the opposite of what he expected. I didn't gloat. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't list his sins back at him or make him grovel. I didn't need to, I'd already won, and the man on my couch knew it better than I did. I just looked at him, calm as a Sunday morning, with my coffee in my hands, and I said, "Mr. Mackey, the first day you came up here, you told me it was just business, nothing personal. Remember? So let's keep it just business. You want to sell this building and walk away from the mess you made. Fine by me. But you are not going to sell it to some other wolf who'll come up these same stairs next year and start this all over again on Mr. Kaminsky and the Reyes kids. By the law, a dying man wrote into my lease 16 years ago, you have to offer this building to me first. So, offer it to me first. I'll take it off your hands." He actually laughed, that thin, scared laugh again. "You?" he said. "Pearl, come on. You can't afford this building. You can't afford the down payment on the front door." And I set down my coffee, and I said, "I can't. But we can," because that was the very last thing I'd done, the move Trent never saw coming. Because men like him cannot imagine that people like us can organize anything more complicated than a complaint. While Trent had been scrambling to dump the building, I had taken my right of first refusal to a community land trust, a nonprofit, whose entire reason for existing is to help the people who actually live in a building buy it, and then hold it in trust so it stays affordable forever, so that no Trent Mackey can ever come for it again. I'd sat in their office on my day off, in the same chair I'd sat in for Sol's lawyer years before, and I'd laid the whole thing out. They had the financing. We had the airtight legal right. And we had a building full of families who would 1,000 times rather own their homes together than be scattered to the Four Winds One relocation check at a time. We exercised the right of first refusal. The land trust put up the money. And Trent Mackey, who had walked into my home and told me I had a name tag and he had lawyers, who had asked me how I thought this would end, Trent Mackey sold our building. The very building he'd schemed for months to empty and flip, to the exact tenants he'd tried to throw away like trash. He took a loss on it. He got his turnover. In the end, he turned the whole building over to us and walked away from this neighborhood for good. I signed the papers with Sol's lease sitting on the table next to me, like he was in the room. I think he was. I think every quiet, overlooked, decent person who was ever written off by somebody powerful was in that room, leaning over my shoulder, watching me sign. When the pen touched the paper and that building became ours, the people who actually lived in it, I had to stop and put my hand over my mouth, because the only thing I could think was, "Sol, look what your kindness did. You came back for me 16 years after you were gone. And now I get to keep our home. And Mr. Kaminsky gets to die warm in his bed. And the Reyes children get to grow up on the floor you built. All because one lonely old man decided, at the very end, to be good to the woman who came back." That is what I signed that day. Not a real estate deal. A promise kept across a grave. Here is how it is now. So you know it's real. And it lasted. The Reyes kids still play in that first floor apartment, except now their family helps govern the building instead of lying awake afraid of it. There's a tenants board now. Marisol Reyes runs the meetings, and they let me off the hook from chairing anything because I told them I'd rather just fix radiators. Mr. Kaminsky died 2 winters ago warm, in his own bed, in his own home, with me holding his hand the way I'd held Sol's, which is all any of us can really ask for at the end, and which Trent Mackey would have stolen from an 83-year-old man for the price of a kitchen island. I think about that a lot. How close it came. How a spreadsheet almost put that old man out in the cold to die a stranger somewhere, and how a dead man's kindness is the only reason it didn't. The hallway light works now. The radiators work. We fixed the leak under the Reyes's sink ourselves the very first week, because it was ours to fix, and there is a particular joy in fixing a thing that belongs to you. The building that Saul Adler raised with his own brother out of brick and hope in the 1950s is owned, now and for good, by the people who actually live inside it, held in a trust so that it can never again be flipped, gutted, or turned into somebody's quick profit. No wolf gets in. Not ever again. Saul made sure of that, and so did I. There's a small brass plaque by the front door now. I had it made, and I paid for it myself, and I didn't ask anybody's permission. It just says, the Adler Building, a home kept. Saul would have grumbled about the fuss and the expense, and then he would have stood in front of it when he thought nobody was looking, and he would have cried. I know he would have, because I do, every time I come up the steps. And me? I'm still in 3B. Still paying my fare $900. Still working my shifts. Still lifting people who can't lift themselves. Still sitting with the frightened ones at 3 a.m. Because that is who I am, and I would not know how to be anybody else. I didn't get rich out of this. I didn't ride off into some shiny new life or open up some little dream of my own. I just kept my home and helped my neighbors keep theirs, and held the line for a building full of people the world had decided were expendable. And that, it turns out, is a fortune. That is the whole entire fortune, and I wouldn't trade it for Trent Mackey's. So here's what I learned. Standing in a bank vault 16 years too late, holding a dead man's handwriting in my shaking hands. The people who think they can roll right over you, the Trent Mackeys of the world, with their suits and their lawyers and their it's just business. Nothing personal, they all share one fatal habit. They never check who they're stepping on. They look at a tired woman with a name tag and swollen feet, and they see someone with nothing. Someone they can move out of the way with a letter and a smirk. It does not occur to them, ever, that the person they're looking down on might be holding the one single thing that breaks their whole plan clean in half. They're so busy looking down on you that they forget to look at your hands. Never let anybody's contempt convince you that your hands are empty. The most dangerous person in the room is very often the one everybody else decided wasn't worth watching. But here's the deeper thing. The part I turn over in my mind on the nights I can't sleep. I didn't earn that lease by being clever, or rich, or powerful. I had none of those things. I earned it by loving an old man the world had forgotten for no reason at all, except that he was mine to love, and somebody had to. I took care of Saul Adler with absolutely no idea, none, that he would ever protect me back. And that's the thing about real kindness. You can't do it for the payout, because the second you're doing it for the payout, it stops being kindness and starts being a transaction. But I'll tell you what I know now that I didn't know then. Standing in that vault. Kindness is the one investment that keeps paying out long after you've forgotten you ever made it. Saul's goodness outlived him by 16 years and reached right up out of his grave to save my home and 6 families along with it. A quiet good deed has a longer life than any loud and greedy one ever will. Trent Mackey's whole scheme lasted a single season. Saul Adler's kindness is holding up an entire building full of families, decades after they put him in the ground. So be good to the people the world overlooks. Be good to the lonely old man, the tired aide, the neighbor nobody else has the time for anymore. Not because it'll come back to you, though, sometimes, on the very night you need it most, in handwriting you'd forgotten. It will. Be good to them, because the loud and the greedy are counting on the rest of us to quietly agree that decent people aren't worth our time. And every single time you refuse, every time you come back, when everybody else only came once you are holding up a little more of the building. You are keeping a home that somebody else was ready to tear down. They never check who they're stepping on. Make sure you are someone worth having underestimated. Thank you for sitting with me through all of it. If this reminded you of someone, a person the powerful wrote off too soon, or a quiet kindness that came back around when it was needed, most share it with someone who needs to hear it. And tell me in the comments, who's the soul in your life? The person whose goodness you're still carrying. I read every single one. Hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next story.